Alright, so 1440p monitors are getting quick, like really quick. The one behind me is the XG27AQM from Asus, and it's 270Hz, which, I mean, let's be real, that's faster than most people's 1080p displays. Today I want to discuss whether it is the best 1440p option that you can buy in terms of response times and motion clarity and stuff like that, and also how it stacks up to a lot of the fastest 1080p options that I've reviewed. Because I mean, you know, we're at the point now where a mid-range GPU like a 3060 Ti or a 3070 can pretty much outpace a lot of games at 1080p, and of course the GPUs of tomorrow are going to be even faster. Realistically, if you're looking for a single monitor for your setup that can kind of offer the least amount of compromise for the most amount of things like competitive gaming, single player gaming, normal day-to-day work and stuff like that, then I don't know if you can get better than kind of what's sitting behind me, or at least the specs and kind of the few monitors that we're going to look at today. 1440p 270Hz really does feel like the least amount of compromise in a single panel. And that's coming from someone who has used pretty much the best of either end of the spectrum, right? I've used 1080p 390Hz, I also use 4K 160Hz, but this could replace probably both of them without being too much compromise on either end. Could definitely use this for competitive gaming, and I probably could use this for, you know, editing at 1440p as well. That would be totally doable. Now, talking about the specs, you know, it's exciting, but it doesn't really tell you how fast this monitor actually is compared to a lot of the other competing options out there. What I really want to discuss today are the response times and, you know, how this compares on a response time level to even some of the fastest 1080p options that you can buy. So the definition of pixel response time here is the amount of time that it takes a single pixel to transition from one color to the next. Faster response times therefore result in clearer motion, and slower response times result in what's called ghosting or motion blur. And that ghosting is really bad for competitive style gaming, especially if you're on a high refresh rate monitor. So we want the fastest and lowest response times possible. Now, up until now, I've solely used the UFO ghosting test from blowbusters.com to evaluate the response times of each gaming monitor, and it does the job pretty well. You can visualize how much ghosting or overshoot each response time mode or monitor has, and it's great for testing modes like DIAC or ULMB. Moving forward though, I mean, we definitely have to step things up a notch. There's a 500Hz monitor on the horizon, there's 1440p 360Hz monitors coming out soon. Clearly the monitor industry is just getting so quick, and we need an objective measurement. So what I have behind me is NVIDIA's new LDAT revision, which basically allows you to measure the proper gray to gray millisecond response time values, which means finally we have an objective response time value to compare with. Now don't worry, I will still be doing the UFO motion tests for each monitor review out there. I think that's what most of you are probably interested in seeing, aside from like this really nerdy response time stuff that I'm about to show you. But I mean, from a testing perspective and in terms of objectively comparing monitor to monitor, this is a lot more useful. So what we're seeing here is a little sneak peek of what's happening when we're talking about response times. In this case, we have a monitor that is switching between the color black, represented as 0, and the color middle gray, represented as 128. And in a perfect world, it would switch to this color instantly, giving us a perfectly clear image, but as we can see, it takes a little bit of time for those pixels to switch to that target color. In this case, we have a response time of 7.4 milliseconds. Now, as you probably know, most gaming monitors have a few different response time overdrive settings, and when we do switch to one of those faster settings, the transition completes now 5 milliseconds faster, which gives us clearer motion, but also at the same time what's called overshoot. This is when the response time overdrive is so aggressive that the pixels momentarily go beyond the target color, and this is exactly what's happening when you see a monitor that has inverse ghosting. In this case, however, it's only about 7% overshoot, and that's actually ideal. Not something that you're really going to notice in terms of inverse ghosting, and we do benefit from those faster response times. This is mostly a problem once we start exceeding about 20% overshoot from what I've seen so far. In fact, in terms of what this looks like using the UFO ghosting test, here are the two modes that we just saw. So level 4 is undoubtedly the mode to use here. Even with 14% average overshoot across all transitions, it still looks great and pretty much ideal. You can actually bump things up a little more though. Level 5 gets us down to a response time average of just 1.8 milliseconds, but at this point a 45% overshoot average does mean that that the inverse ghosting is really noticeable and something that you'll want to avoid. Now, the response time curve that we looked at previously, that was only for a single gray to gray transition from black to gray, otherwise known as 0 to 128. But to properly test response times, we should test a lot more. So 0 to 128, as we saw, took 2.4 milliseconds. Then we also test 0 to 160, which takes 2.6. 0 to 192 takes 2.8 milliseconds. Eventually, with enough gray to gray transitions tested, we can get a bigger picture of what's happening and get the monitor's average response time. In this case, it's 2.5 milliseconds, which for a 1440p 270Hz monitor is really damn fast. We can also see then what the overshoot or inverse ghosting is for each of those transitions, and in some cases, there is quite evident overshoot above say 50% or so, but most of them barely have any overshoot at all. So finally, proper response time testing. As you can see, I'm really excited about it, but in isolation, it doesn't really tell you much, right? Like if I tell you a monitor has a 2.5 millisecond average response time, it's not really useful. So what we want to do now is compare to a lot of different other gaming monitors. I've tested a handful of the important ones for this review. For example, the Acer Nitro 390Hz. How fast are the response times on this compared to that? Well, in terms of response times, it's actually faster. Again, what we're looking at here is effectively how much ghosting each monitor has. All of the results are pretty damn quick, but I guess the point here is that, yeah, there are current 1440p monitors out there that are as quick as some of the highest refresh rate 1080p options on the market. Now, a closer look at those three 1440p high refresh rate options, the Asus XG27AQM has the best response time performance out of the three, but the other two aren't that far off at all. In fact, when we compare the UFO tests, we can see just how similar all three look. I mean, you have to keep the perspective of what this is actually going to look like when you're playing and focusing on your gameplay, and with that considered, they're all virtually the same. I will give points to the XG27AQM though for being the clearest and the best tuned. One reason for that is probably due to the physical G-Sync module that the other two 1440p options do not have. The other two are G-Sync compatible, but don't have that module installed. Now, something that G-Sync processor does provide is what's called a variable overdrive, which means that the overdrive amount is always adapting to the refresh rate. That's compared to how overdrive normally works on most monitors without this, which is basically just a static overdrive amount. That means that you get different amounts of overshoot at different refresh rate values. Usually what happens is that the overshoot increases as the refresh rate decreases. The PG27 on the other hand, you can kind of think of as having like optimized overdrive if you're sticking within that G-Sync range, with overshoot not becoming a problem if you're lowering refresh rates like the other two. In practice, it's not a huge difference. The PG does look a little bit clearer here when they're both set to 144Hz, but it is one of the benefits of that G-Sync module worth noting. Now, on the flip side of this, something that the XG27 has that the PG27 doesn't is support for ELMB. This is Asus's implementation of backlight strobing, also known as motion blur reduction, and since this is one of the main distinctions between these two monitors, I was really excited to check it out. The result though is just okay. To be honest, the response times are already so good on this display that I probably wouldn't even bother enabling this. Now, in addition to this, the XG27 also has ELMB sync, which I was even more excited for. This is basically ELMB plus G-Sync mashed together. The backlight strobing essentially adapts on the fly depending on what your frame rate is, which is kind of the best of both worlds. This mode has a lot of potential, but on the XG27AQM, I don't know what's happening here, but it just plainly doesn't look good. Even at the same frame rates as standard ELMB, without adaptive sync, it just looks worse. Especially at 144Hz, which is the whole point of ELMB sync, to actually be better at those lower refresh rates, standard ELMB at 144Hz looks a lot clearer. In fact, ELMB at this refresh rate is pretty good. Like if you have games that you want to run at 144Hz and you're confident that you can consistently get that frame rate, this would actually be a decent mode to use. Now, the Acer Predator 270Hz also has a backlight strobing mode, slightly better than the Asus, but kind of falls in the same basket, right? These monitors are already so good without it that I think just enabling the correct overdrive mode and G-Sync is pretty much just the way to go. Now, something that's kind of interesting and exclusive on the PG27AQM is NVIDIA's Reflex Analyzer, which can measure the latency of your system and your games. I've used this personally for a few projects here and there, but it's a feature that most consumers and gamers probably won't won't find that useful. It's kind of something that you'll switch on and check after a hardware upgrade or something like that, make sure everything's running good, but that's probably it. Unfortunately, this is one of the main reasons that the PG27-9QM is so much more expensive currently than the XG27AQM, so just keep that in mind. So in terms of these enthusiast 1440p options, the XG27AQM, the PG27-9QM, and the XB273UGX from Acer, I mean, they're all really good options. If you bought either one, don't feel like you kind of bought the wrong one because they're all really good. Personally, if you're kind of, starting from scratch and you're looking at getting one, I would pick the XG27. I think it's a lot cheaper than the PG27 at the moment. The slightly higher refresh rate is also nice, 270Hz versus 240Hz, and also the overdrive modes just seem a little bit better tuned than what I saw on the Acer Predator. Now, as fast as these 1440p options are, I mean, they are incredibly quick. 1080p is still something that you might want to look at. I mean, 1080p still feels like, to me, the most competitive and lowest latency experience that you can currently get. Refresh rates are higher, frame rates are typically higher as well, and there is something to be said about gaming on a smaller display, which most people are kind of more comfortable with. 24-inch and 25-inch versus 27-inch might only be like a couple of inches, but when it's at arm's length, that bigger panel does feel a lot bigger than those numbers suggest. And the other side of this is that you do need a pretty hefty GPU to make use of these 1440p high refresh rate options. I mean, don't plan on getting this if you have like a 3060 or a 3050 or something like that. You want to be having like a 3080 or higher, or at least be looking forward to the next generation of GPUs as an upgrade to support those kind of pixels at that refresh rate. By all means, you can also kind of consider it as a bit of a future-proofing option for your setup as well. Maybe you're currently gaming in the kind of 165Hz range, but maybe you want that extra refresh rate headroom available to you in the future. That's something I can totally respect. And in terms of the 1440p 360Hz options, which were announced a couple of months ago, I think, I did ask Asus for a bit of an ETA, but they're not comfortable giving me a release date or anything just yet. So I guess we'll see, maybe in time for the new GPUs or towards the end of the year. But yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. Otherwise, hope you found this video helpful. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.